Hello there. I'm your imaginary friend. Today, I'd like to continue on with our reading of Arthur Machen's The Terror. Now, if you haven't heard the first part of that, do go start with that. If you haven't heard the second or the third, yeah, get in there somewhere. You can find it. I have faith in you. We're continuing on with, excuse me, a bit of a frog in my throat. Part 9, The Light on the Water. Let it be noted carefully that so far Merritt had not the slightest suspicion that the terror of Midlingham was quick over Myrion. Lewis had watched and shepherded him carefully. He'd let out no suspicion of what had happened to Myrion, and before taking his brother-in-law to the club, he had passed round a hint among the members. He did not tell the truth about Midlingham, and here again is a point of interest, that as the terror deepened, the general public cooperated voluntarily, and one would say almost subconsciously, with the authorities in concealing what they knew from one another. But he gave out a desirable portion of the truth, that his brother-in-law was nervy, not by any means up to the mark, and that it was therefore desirable that he should be spared the knowledge of the intolerable and tragic mysteries which were being enacted all about them. He knows about that poor fellow who was found in the marsh, said Lewis, and he has a kind of vague suspicion that there is something out of the common about the case, but no more than that. A clear case of suggested, or rather commanded, suicide, said Remnant. I regard it as a strong confirmation of my theory. Perhaps so, said the doctor, dreading lest he might have to hear about the Z-ray all over again. But please don't let anything out to him. I want him to get built up thoroughly before he goes back to Midlingham. Then, on the other hand, Merritt was as still as death about the doings of the Midlands. He hated to think of them, much more to speak of them, and thus, as I say, he and the men at the Port Club kept their secrets from one another, and thus from the beginning to the end of the terror, the links were not drawn together. In many cases, no doubt, A and B met every day and talked familiarly, it may be confidentially, on other matters of all sorts, each having in his possession half of the truth, which he concealed from the other, so the two halves were never put together to make a whole. Merritt, as the doctor guessed, had a kind of uneasy feeling, it scarcely amounted to a suspicion, as to the business of the marsh, chiefly because he thought the official talk about the railway embankment and the course of the river rank nonsense. But finding that nothing more happened, he let the matter drop from his mind, and settled himself down to enjoy his holiday. He found to his delight that there were no sentries or watchers to hinder him from the approach to Larnac Bay, a delicious cove, a place where the ash grove and the green meadow and the glistening brackens sloped gently down to the red rocks and firm yellow sands. Merritt remembered a rock that formed a comfortable seat, and here he established himself of a golden afternoon and gazed at the blue of the sea and the crimson bastions and bays of the coast as it bent inwards toward Saunau and swept out again southward to the odd-shaped promontory called the Dragon's Head. Merritt gazed on, amused by the antics of the porpoises who were tumbling and splashing and gambolling a little way out at sea, charmed by the pure and radiant air that was so different from the oily smoke that often stood for heaven at Midlingham, and charmed, too, by the white farmhouses dotted here and there on the heights of the curving coast. Then he noticed a little rowboat at about 200 yards from the shore. There were 2 or 3 people aboard. He could not quite make out how many, and they seemed to be doing something with a line. They were no doubt fishing, and Merritt, who disliked fish, wondered how people could spoil such an afternoon, such a sea, such pellucid and radiant air by trying to catch white, flabby, offensive, evil-smelling creatures that would be excessively nasty when cooked. He puzzled over this problem, and turned away from it to the contemplation of the crimson headlands. And then he says that he noticed that signaling was going on. Flashing lights of intense brilliance, he declares, were coming from one of those farms on the heights of the coast. It was as if white fire was sprouting from it. Merritt was certain, as the light appeared and disappeared, that some message was being sent, and he regretted that he knew nothing of heliography. 3 short flashes, a long and very brilliant flash, then 2 short flashes. Merritt fumbled in his pocket for pencil and paper so that he might record these signals, and bringing his eyes down to the sea level, he became aware with amazement and horror that the boat had disappeared. All that he could see was some vague dark object far to westward, running out with the tide. Now it is certain, unfortunately, that the Mary Ann was capsized, and that 2 schoolboys and the sailor in charge were drowned. The bones of the boat were found amongst the rocks far along the coast, and the 3 bodies were also washed ashore. The sailor could not swim at all, the boys only a little, and it needs an exceptionally fine swimmer to fight against the outward suck of the tide as it rushes past Pengarring Point. But I have no belief whatever in Merritt's theory. He held, and still holds for all I know, that the flashes of light which he saw coming from Penyrhall, the farmhouse on the height, had some connection with the disaster to the Mary Ann. When it was ascertained that a family were spending their summer at the farm, and that the governess was a German, though a long naturalized German, Merritt could not see that there was anything left to argue about, though there might be many details to discover. But in my opinion, all this was a mere mare's nest. The flashes of brilliant light were caused, no doubt, by the sun lighting up one window of the farmhouse after the other. Still, Merritt was convinced from the very first, even before the damning circumstance of the German governess was brought to light. And on the evening of the disaster, as Lewis and he sat together after dinner, he was endeavoring to put what he called the common sense of the matter to the doctor. "If you hear a shot," said Merritt, "and you see a man fall, you know pretty well what killed him." There was a flutter of wild wings in the room. A great moth beat to and fro and dashed itself madly against the ceiling, the walls, the glass bookcase. Then a sputtering sound, a momentary dimming of the lamp. The moth had succeeded in its mysterious quest. "Can you tell me," said Lewis, as if he were answering Merritt, "why moths rush into the flame?" Lewis had put his question as to the strange habits of the common moth to Merritt with the deliberate intent of closing the debate on death by heliograph. The query was suggested, of course, by the incident of the moth and the lamp, and Lewis thought that he had said, "Oh, shut up," in a somewhat elegant manner. And in fact, Merritt looked dignified, remained silent, and helped himself to port. That was the end that the doctor had desired. He had no doubt in his mind that the affair of the Mary Ann was but one more item in a long account of horrors that grew larger almost with every day, and he was in no humor to listen to wild and futile theories as to the manner in which the disaster had been accomplished. Here was a proof that the terror that was upon them was mighty not only on the land but on the waters. For Lewis could not see that the boat could have been attacked by any ordinary means of destruction. From Merritt's story, it must have been in shallow water. The shore of Larnac Bay shelves very gradually, and the Admiralty charts show the depth of water 200 yards out to be only 2 fathoms. This would be too shallow for a submarine. And it could not have been shelled, and it could not have been torpedoed. There was no explosion. The disaster might have been due to carelessness. Boys, he considered, will play the fool anywhere, even in a boat. But he did not think so. The sailor would have stopped them. And it may be mentioned that the 2 boys were, as a matter of fact, extremely steady, sensible young fellows, not in the least likely to play foolish tricks of any kind. Lewis was immersed in these reflections, having successfully silenced his brother-in-law. He was trying in vain to find some clue to the horrible enigma. The Midlingham theory of a concealed German force hiding in places under the earth was extravagant enough, and yet it seemed the only solution that approached plausibility. But then again, Even a subterranean German host would hardly account for this wreckage of a boat floating on a calm sea. And then what of the tree, the burning in it that had appeared in the garden there a few weeks ago, and the cloud with the burning in it that had shone over the trees of the Midland village? I think I have already written something of the probable emotion of the mathematician confronted suddenly with an undoubted two-sided triangle. I said, if I remember, that he would be forced in decency to go mad, and I believe that Lewis was very near to this point. He felt himself confronted with an intolerable problem that most instantly demanded solution, and yet, with the same breath, as it were, denied the possibility of there being any solution. People were being killed in an inscrutable manner by some inscrutable means, day after day, and one asked why and how, and there seemed no answer. In the Midlands, where every kind of munitionment was manufactured, the explanation of German agency was plausible. And even if the subterranean notion was to be rejected as savoring altogether too much of the fairy tale, or rather of the sensational romance, it was possible that the backbone of the theory was true. The Germans might have planted their agents in some way or another in the midst of our factories. But here in Myrion, what serious effect could be produced by the causal and indiscriminate slaughter of a couple of schoolboys in a boat, or of a harmless holiday-maker in a marsh? The creation of an atmosphere of terror and dismay was possible, of course, but it hardly seemed tolerable, in spite of the enormities of Louvain and the Lusitania. Into these meditations, and into the still dignified silence of Merritt, broke the rap on the door of Lewis's man, and those words which harass the ease of the country doctor when he tries to take any ease. "You wanted in the surgery, if you please, sir." Lewis bustled out, and appeared no more that night. The doctor had been summoned to a little hamlet on the outskirts of Porth, separated from it by half a mile or 3/4 of road. One dignifies indeed this settlement without a name in calling it a hamlet. It was a mere row of 4 cottages, built about 100 years ago for the accommodation of the workers in a quarry long since disused. In one of these cottages the doctor found a father and mother, weeping and crying out to Dr. Bach, Dr. Bach, and 2 frightened children, and one little body still and dead. It was the youngest of the 3, little Johnny, and he was dead. The doctor found that the child had been asphyxiated. He felt the clothes, they were dry. It was not a case of drowning. He looked at the neck, there was no mark of strangling. He asked the father how it happened, and father and mother, weeping most lamentably, declared they had no knowledge of how their child had been killed, unless it was the people that had done it. The Celtic fairies are still malignant. Lewis asked what had happened that evening. Where had the child been? Was he with his brother and sister? Don't they know anything about it? Reduced into some sort of order from its original piteous confusion, this is the story that the doctor gathered. All 3 children had been well and happy through the day. They'd walked in with the mother and Mrs. Roberts to Porth on a marketing expedition in the afternoon. They'd returned to the cottage, had had their tea, and afterwards played about on the road in front of the house. John Roberts had come home somewhat late from his work, and it was after dusk when the family sat down to supper. Supper over, the 3 children went out again to play with other children from the cottage next door, Mrs. Roberts telling them that they might have half an hour before going to bed. The 2 mothers came to the cottage gates at the same moment and called out to their children to come along and be quick about it. The 2 small families had been playing on the strip of turf across the road, just by the stile into the fields. The children ran across the road, all of them except Johnny Roberts. His brother Willie said that just as their mother called them, he heard Johnny cry out, "Oh, what is that beautiful shiny thing over the stile?" Part 10. The Child and the Marsh. The Child and the Moth. The little Robertses ran across the road, up the path, and into the lighted room. Then they noticed that Johnny had not followed them. Mrs. Roberts was doing something in the back kitchen, and Mr. Roberts had gone out to the shed to bring in some sticks for the next morning's fire. Mrs. Roberts heard the children run in and went on with her work. The children whispered to one another that Johnny would catch it when their mother came out of the back room and found him missing, but they expected he would run in through the open door any minute. But 6 or 7, perhaps 10 minutes passed, and there was no Johnny. Then the father and mother came into the kitchen together and saw that their little boy was not there. They thought it was some small piece of mischief, that the 2 other children had hidden the boy somewhere in the room and in the big cupboard, perhaps. "What have you done with him, then?" said Mrs. Roberts. "Come out, you little rascal, directly in a minute." There was no little rascal to come out, and Margaret Roberts, the girl, said that Johnny had not come across the road with them. He must be still playing all by himself by the hedge. "What did you let him stay like that for?" said Mrs. Roberts. "Can't I trust you for 2 minutes together? Indeed, to goodness, you are all of you more trouble than you're worth." She went to the open door. "Johnny, come in directly, or you'll be sorry for it, Johnny." The poor woman called at the door. She went out to the gate and called there. "Come, you little Johnny. Come, you Machen. There's a good boy. I do see you hiding there." She thought he must be hiding in the shadow of the hedge, and that he would come running and laughing. He was always such a happy little fellow, to her across the road. But no little merry figure danced out of the gloom of the still dark night. It was all silence. It was then, as the mother's heart began to chill, though she still called cheerfully to the missing child, that the elder boy told how Johnny had said there was something beautiful by the stile. And perhaps he did climb over, and he's running now about the meadow and has lost his way. The father got his lantern then, and the whole family went crying and calling about the meadow, promising cakes and sweets and a fine toy to poor Johnny if he would come to them. They found the little body under the ash grove in the middle of the field. He was quite still and dead, so still that a great moth had settled on his forehead, fluttering away when they lifted him up. Dr. Lewis heard this story. There was nothing to be done, little to be said, to these most unhappy people. "Take care of the 2 that you have left to you," said the doctor as he went away. "Don't let them out of your sight if you can help it. It is dreadful times that we're living in." It is curious to record that all through these dreadful times the simple little season went through its accustomed course at Porth. The war and its consequences had somewhat thinned the numbers of the summer visitors. Still a very fair contingent of them occupied the hotels and boarding houses and lodging houses, and bathed from the old-fashioned machines on one beach, or from the new-fashioned tents on the other, and sauntered in the sun, or lay stretched out in the shade under the trees that grow down almost to the water's edge. Porth never tolerated Ethiopians or shows of any kind on its sands, but the Rockets did very well during that summer in their garden entertainment given in the castle grounds, and the fit-up companies that came to the assembly rooms are said to have paid their bills to a woman and to a man. Porth depends very largely on its midland and northern custom of a prosperous, well-established sort. People who think Llandudno overcrowded and Colwyn Bay too raw and red and new, come year after year to the placid old town in the southwest and delight in its peace. And as I say, they enjoyed themselves much as usual there in the summer of 1915. Now and then they became conscious, as Mr. Merritt became conscious, that they could not wander about quite in the old way, but they accepted sentries and coast watchers and people who politely pointed out the advantages of seeing the view from this point rather than from that, as very necessary consequences of the dreadful war that was being waged. Nay, as a Manchester man said, after having been turned back from his favourite walk to Castell Coch, it was gratifying to think that they were so well looked after. "So far as I can see," he added, "there's nothing to prevent a submarine from standing out there by Innis Sant and landing half a dozen men in a collapsible boat in any of these little coves. And pretty fools we should look, shouldn't we? With our throats cut on the sands, or carried back to Germany in the submarine. He tipped the coast watcher half a crown. That's right, lad, he said. You give us the tip. Now here was a strange thing. The North countryman had his thoughts on elusive submarines and German raiders. The watcher had simply received instructions to keep people off the Castlecock fields without reason assigned. And there could be no doubt that the authorities themselves, while they marked out the fields as in the terror zone, gave their orders in the dark, and were themselves profoundly in the dark as to the manner of the slaughter that had been done there. For if they'd understood what had happened, they would have understood also that the restrictions were useless. The Manchester man was warned off his walk about 10 days after Johnny Roberts's death. The watcher had been placed at his post because the night before a young farmer had been found by his wife lying in the grass close to the castle, with no scar on him nor any mark of violence, but stone dead. The wife of the dead man, Joseph Craddock, finding her husband lying motionless on the dewy turf, went white and stricken up the path to the village and got 2 men who bore the body to the farm. Lewis was sent for and knew at once when he saw the dead man that he had perished in the way that the little Roberts boy had perished, whatever that awful way might be. Craddock had been asphyxiated, and here again there was no mark of a grip on the throat. It might have been a piece of work by Burke and Hare, the doctor reflected. A pitch plaster might have been clapped over the man's mouth and nostrils and held there. Then a thought struck him. His brother-in-law had talked of a new kind of poison gas that was said to be used against the munition workers in the Midlands. Was it possible that the deaths of the man and the boy were due to some such instrument? He applied his tests, but could find no trace of any gas having been employed. Carbonic acid gas? A man could not be killed with that in the open air. To be fatal, that required a confined space, such a position as the bottom of a huge vat or of a well. He did not know how Craddock had been killed. He confessed it to himself. He'd been suffocated. That's all he could say. It seemed that the man had gone out at about 9:30 to look after some beasts. The field in which they were was about 5 minutes' walk from the house. He told his wife he would be back in a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes. He did not return. And when he had gone for 3/4 of an hour, Mrs. Craddock went out to look for him. She went into the field where the beasts were, and everything seemed all right, but there was no trace of Craddock. She called out. There was no answer. Now the meadow in which the cattle were pastured is high ground. A hedge divides it from the fields which fall gently down to the castle and the sea. Mrs. Craddock hardly seemed able to say why, having failed to find her husband among his beasts, she turned to the path which led to Castlecock. She said at first that she had thought that one of the oxen might have broken through the hedge and strayed, and that Craddock had perhaps gone after it. And then, correcting herself, she said, there was that, and then there was something else that I could not make out at all. It seemed to me that the hedge did look different from usual. To be sure, things do look different at night, and there was a bit of a sea mist about. But somehow it did look odd to me, and I said to myself, have I lost my way then? She declared that the shape of the trees in the hedge appeared to have changed, and besides, it had a look as if it was lighted up somehow. And so she went on towards the stile to see what all this could be. And when she came near, everything was as usual. She looked over the stile and called and hoped to see her husband coming towards her or to hear his voice. But there was no answer. Glancing down the path, she saw, or thought she saw, some sort of brightness on the ground. A dim sort of light like a bunch of glowworms in a hedge-bank. And so I climbed over the stile and went down the path, and the light seemed to melt away. And there was my poor husband lying on his back, saying not a word to me when I spoke to him and touched him. So for Lewis, the terror blackened and became altogether intolerable, and others he perceived felt as he did. He did not know, he never asked whether the men at the club had heard of these deaths of the child and the young farmer, but no one spoke of them. Indeed, the change was evident. At the beginning of the terror, men spoke of nothing else. Now it had become all too awful for ingenious chatter of laboured and grotesque theories. And Lewis had received a letter from his brother-in-law at Midlingham. It contained the sentence, "I'm afraid Fanny's health has not greatly benefited by her visit to Porth. There are still several symptoms I don't like at all." And this told him, in a phraseology that the doctor and Merritt had agreed upon, that the terror remained heavy in the Midland town. It was soon after the death of Craddock that people began to tell strange tales of a sound that was to be heard of nights about the hills and valleys to the northward of Porth. A man who had missed the last train from Myros, had been forced to tramp the 10 miles between Myros and Porth, seems to have been the first to hear it. He said he'd got to the top of the hill by Tredone, somewhere between 10:30 and 11, when he first noticed an odd noise that he could not make out at all. It was like a shout, a long drawn-out, dismal wail coming from a great way off, faint with distance. He stopped to listen, thinking at first that it might be owls hooting in the woods, but it was different, he said, from that. It was a long cry, and then there was silence, and then it began over again. He could make nothing of it, and feeling frightened, he did not quite know of what, he walked on briskly and was glad to see the lights of Porth Station. He told his wife of this dismal sound that night, and she told the neighbors, and most of them thought that it was all fancy, or drink, or the owls after all. But the night after, 2 or 3 people who had been to some small merrymaking in a cottage just off the Myros road heard the sound as they were going home, soon after 10. They too described it as a long wailing cry, indescribably dismal in the stillness of the autumn night. "Like the ghost of a voice," said one. "As if it came up from the bottom of the earth," said another. Part 11. At Trefloyne Farm. Let it be remembered, again and again, that all the while that the terror lasted, there was no common stock of information as to the dreadful things that were being done. The press had not said one word upon it. There was no criterion by which the mass of the people could separate fact from mere vague rumor, no test by which ordinary misadventure or disaster could be distinguished from the achievements of the secret and awful force that was at work. And so, with every event of the passing day, a harmless commercial traveller might show himself in the course of his business in the tumble-down main street of Myros and find himself regarded with looks of fear and suspicion as a possible worker of murder, while it is likely enough that the true agents of the terror went quite unnoticed. And since the real nature of all this mystery of death was unknown, it followed easily that the signs and warnings and omens of it were all the more unknown. Here was horror, there was horror. There was no link to join one horror with another, no common basis of knowledge from which the connection between this horror and that horror might be inferred. So there was no one who suspected at all that this dismal and hollow sound that was now heard of nights in the region to the north of Porth had any relation at all to the case of the little girl who went out one afternoon to pick purple flowers and never returned, or to the case of the man whose body was taken out of the peaty slime of the marsh, or to the case of Craddock dead in his fields, with a strange glimmering of light about his body, as his wife reported. And it is a question as to how far the rumour of this melancholy nocturnal summons got abroad at all. Lewis heard of it as a country doctor hears of most things, driving up and down the lanes, but he heard of it without much interest, with no sense that it was in any sort of relation to the terror. Remnant had been given the story of the hollow and echoing voice of the darkness in a coloured and picturesque form. He employed a Tredonoc man to work in his garden once a week. The gardener had not heard the summons himself, but he knew a man who had done so. Thomas Jenkins, Pentoppin. He did put his head out late last night to see what the weather was like, and he was cutting a field of corn the next day, and he did tell me that when he was with the Methodists in Cardigan, he did never hear no singing eloquence of the chapels that was like to it. He did declare it was like a wailing of Judgment Day. Remnant considered the matter, and was inclined to think that the sound must be caused by a subterranean inlet of the sea. There might be, he supposed, an imperfect or half-opened or tortuous blowhole in the Tredoc woods, and the noise of the tides surging up below might very well produce that effect of a hollow wailing far away. But neither he nor anyone else paid much attention to the matter, save the few who heard the call at dead of night as it echoed awfully over the Black Hills. The sound had been heard for 3 or perhaps 4 nights, when the people coming out of Tredonoc Church after morning service on Sunday noticed that there was a big yellow sheepdog in the churchyard. The dog, it appeared, had been waiting for the congregation, for it at once attached itself to them, at first to the whole body, and then to a group of half a dozen who took the turning to the right. 2 of these presently went off over the fields to their respective houses, and 4 strolled on in the leisurely Sunday morning manner of the country, and these the dog followed, keeping to heel all the time. The men were talking hay, corn, and markets, and paid no attention to the animal, and so they strolled along the autumn lane till they came to a gate in the hedge, whence a roughly made farm road went through the fields, and dipped down into the woods and to Trefloyne Farm. Then the dog became like a possessed creature. He barked furiously. He ran up to one of the men and looked up at him, if he was begging for his life, as the man said, and then rushed to the gate and stood by it, wagging his tail and barking at intervals. The man stared and laughed. "Whose dog will that be?" said one of them. "It'll be Thomas Griffith's, Trefloyne," said another. "Well, then, why doesn't he go home? Go home, then." He went through the gesture of picking up a stone from the road and throwing it at the dog. "Go home, then. Over the gate with you." But the dog never stirred. He barked and whined and ran up to the men and then back to the gate. At last he came to one of them and crawled and abased himself on the ground and took hold of the man's coat and tried to pull him in the direction of the gate. The farmer shook the dog off, and the 4 went off on their way, and the dog stood in the road and watched them, and then put up its head and uttered a long and dismal howl that was despair. The 4 farmers thought nothing of it. Sheepdogs in the country are dogs to look after sheep, and their whims and fancies are not studied. But the yellow dog, he was a kind of degenerate collie, haunted the Tredonoc lanes from that day. He came to a cottage door one night and scratched at it, and when it was opened, lay down, and then, barking, ran to the garden gate and waited, entreating it, as it seemed, the cottager to follow him. They drove him away, and again he gave that long howl of anguish. It was almost as bad, they said, as the noise that they'd heard a few nights before. And then it occurred to somebody, so far as I can make out with no particular reference to the odd conduct of the Trefloyne sheepdog, that Thomas Griffith had not been seen for some past. He had missed market day at Porth. He had not been at Tredonoc Church, where he was a pretty regular attendant on Sunday. And then, as heads were put together, it appeared that nobody had seen any of the Griffith family for days and days. Now, in a town, even a small town, this process of putting heads together is pretty quick business. In the country, especially in a countryside of wild lands and scattered and lonely farms and cottages, the affair takes time. Harvest was going on, everybody was busy in his own fields, and after the long day's hard work, neither the farmer nor his men felt inclined to stroll about in search of news or gossip. A harvester at the day's end is ready for supper and sleep, and for nothing else. And so it was late in that week when it was discovered that Thomas Griffith and all his house had vanished from this world. I've often been reproached for my curiosity over questions which are apparently of slight importance, or of no importance at all. I love to inquire, for instance, into the question of the visibility of a lighted candle at a distance. Suppose, that is, a candle lighted on a still dark night in the country. What is the greatest distance at which you can see that there is a light at all? And then as to the human voice, what is its carrying distance, under good conditions, as a mere sound, apart from any matter of making out words that may be uttered? They are trivial questions, no doubt. But they have always interested me, and the latter point has its application to the strange business of Trefloyne. That melancholy and hollow sound, that wailing summons that appalled the hearts of those who heard it, was indeed a human voice, produced in a very exceptional manner, and it seems to have been heard at points varying from 1.5 miles to 2 miles from the farm. I do not know whether this is anything extraordinary. I do not know whether the peculiar method of production was calculated to increase or diminish the carrying power of the sound. Again and again, I have laid emphasis in this story of the terror on the strange isolation of many of the farms and cottages in my round. I have done so in the effort to convince the townsman of something that he's never known. To the Londoner, a house 1/4 mile from the outlying suburban lamp, with no other dwelling within 200 yards, is a lonely house, a place to fit with ghosts and mysteries and terrors. How can he understand, then, the true loneliness of the white farmhouses of Myrion, dotted here and there, for the most part not even on the little lanes and deep winding byways, but set in the very heart of the fields, or alone on huge bastioned headlands facing the sea, and whether on the high verge of the sea, or on the hills, or in the hollows of the inner country, hidden from the sight of men, far from the sound of any common call. There is Pinner Hall, for example, the farm from which the foolish Merritt thought he saw signals of light being made. From seaward it is, of course, widely visible, but from landward, owing partly to the curving and indented configuration of the bay, I doubt whether any other habitation views it from a nearer distance than 3 miles. And of all these hidden and remote places, I doubt if any is so deeply buried as Trefloyne. I have little or no Welsh, I'm sorry to say, but I suppose that the name is corrupted from Trelwyn or Trefilwyn, the place in the grove, and indeed it lies in the very heart of dark overhanging woods. A deep narrow valley runs down from the highlands of the Alt through these woods, through steep hillsides of bracken and gorse, right down to the great marsh, whence Merritt saw the dead man being carried. The valley lies away from any road, even from that by-road, little better than a bridle path where the 4 farmers, returning from church, were perplexed by the strange antics of the sheepdog. One cannot say that the valley is overlooked, even from a distance, for so narrow is it that the ash groves that rim it on either side seem to meet and shut it in. I, at all events, have never found any high place from which Trefloyne is visible, though looking down from the Alt, I have seen blue wood smoke rising from its hidden chimneys. Such was the place, then, to which one September afternoon a party went up to discover what had happened to Griffith and his family. There were 6 farmers, a couple of policemen, and 4 soldiers carrying their arms. Those last had been lent by the officer commanding at the camp. Lewis, too, was part of the party. He had heard by chance that no one knew what had become of Griffith and his family. He was anxious about a young fellow, a painter of his acquaintance, who had been lodging at Trefloyne all the summer. They all met by the gate of Tredonoc Church, and tramped solemnly along the narrow lane, all of them, I think, with some vague discomfort of mind, a certain shadowy fear, as of men who do not quite know what they may encounter. Lewis heard the corporal and the 3 soldiers arguing over their orders. "The captain says to me," muttered the corporal, "don't hesitate to shoot if there's any trouble." "Shoot what, sir?" I says. "The trouble," says he, and that's all I could get out of him. The men grumbled in reply. Lewis thought he heard some obscure reference to rat poison and wondered what they were talking about. They came to the gate in the hedge, where the farm road led down to Trefloyne. They followed this track, roughly made, with grass growing up between its loosely laid stones, down by the hedge from field to wood, till at last they came to the sudden walls of the valley and the sheltering groves of the ash trees. Here the way curved down the steep hillside and bent southward, and followed henceforward the hidden hollow of the valley under the shadow of the trees. Here was the farm enclosure, the outlying walls of the yard and the barns and sheds and outhouses. One of the farmers threw open the gate and walked into the yard, and forthwith began bellowing at the top of his voice, "Thomas Griffith! Thomas Griffith! Where be you, Thomas Griffith?" The rest followed him. The corporal snapped out an order over his shoulder, and there was a rattling metallic noise as the men fixed their bayonets, and became in an instant dreadful dealers out of death, in place of harmless fellows with a feeling for beer. "Thomas Griffith!" again bellowed the farmer. There was no answer to this summons, but they found poor Griffith lying on his face at the edge of the pond in the middle of the yard. There was a ghastly wound in his side, as if a sharp stake had been driven into his body.